This video is about Marilyn Dumont, The Devil's Language. So a couple of things I want you to take away from this is, what is the appropriate or the expected subject matter of Indigenous writers? And then, what is the relationship of language to culture? Okay, so these are, enormous concepts that we want to use this poem and the other readings for this week to think about. Okay? So she begins by saying, I have reconsidered Eliot. Now she's talking about T.S. Eliot, the American poet, who largely spent most of his life in England. And Eliot was an incredibly influential figure in the English language, probably the most important poet of the first half of the 20th century, and his influence is undeniable. Anybody who was anybody wanted to be like Eliot. His historical reception has altered a bit over the years, but still, really, really important figure. And so she says in the second line, that he kind of represents the great white way of writing English. Standard, that is, the great white way. And so she's bringing in questions of race into language. And so in the North American context, in the Indigenous context, we're talking about colonialism here, okay? And she says that this way of thinking, this way of writing, speaking, the language and the culture, quote, has measured, judged, and assessed me all my life, okay? Measured, judged, and assessed, okay? That these are the strategies, the rhetorical and political and scientific strategies that determine the value, the worth of a person, okay? By its lily white words, its picket fence sentences and manicured paragraphs. So everything has a particular way of doing it. I look out my window in my suburban neighborhood and all the little houses in a row and so forth, okay? That these are just the structures of colonialism writ large in very different contexts. We can have it from the writing on the page to the layout of cities and neighborhoods and so forth. Okay? One wrong sound and you're shelved in the native literature section. Okay, that what does it mean to write from an Indigenous perspective? And if you write from an Indigenous perspective, what are you supposed to say? Are you supposed to talk about residential schools? Is that what you're supposed to talk about? Are you supposed to talk about the 60s scoop? Is that appropriate? Are you supposed to talk about Sir John A. Macdonald? Are you supposed to talk about colonialism? What if you just want to talk about, trees or bears or salmon or, the school system, how you educate your people, are those appropriate things, right? But notice that so often the native writer, native literature section gets pigeonholed into resistance writing, a mad Indian, unpredictable, on the warpath, native ethnic protest, as if this is the only thing that Indigenous writing does, and therefore we can put it in a nice little box, put it into the native literature section and say, there's the resistance writing over there. When in fact, there's obviously a much broader scope that could be written about. But what, say, white authors pay attention to is, here's a poem. This is a great Indigenous poem because this person's speaking out against colonialism. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. This poem's doing it too. But at the same time, that's not the only thing that Indigenous people talk about. They don't just, sit around and talk, how was your oppression today? They do other things on a daily basis. They'll go to the store, play hockey, have kids, do regular everyday things. But when we talk about the culture generally, it's like, those people, they're so angry, or, whatever it is that people say about this group of people. And she's, just kind of putting this in very broad strokes, like the great white way is to do it this way. And this is how I'm measured, judged, and assessed, that I'm an Indigenous writer, therefore all I ever talk about is Indigenous issues and Indigenous oppression, when that is not necessarily the case. Okay? The great white way could silence us all, or in fact limit us to just one thing, resistance, if we let it. It's had its hand over my mouth since my first day of school, since Dick and Jane, ABCs, and fingernail checks. So these are the things, happen at residential schools, the indoctrination of Indigenous children into the great white way of reading and thinking and being. It's really interesting if you go back in history and read some of the statements of policy of the Department of Indian Affairs and how they're going to assimilate these indigenous kids. That certain writers like Duncan Campbell Scott said, there will be no Indian problem in the future because we will have entirely culturally assimilated them into this great white way of thinking. Now, those were not his words, and some of them were, but he wasn't talking about the great white way. But he's like, we will get rid of this Indian problem, that this was a problem to be assimilated into white culture. Okay. And so if you misspoke, or spoke your own language in these residential schools, you were a dumb Indian, dumb, drunk, or violent. My father doesn't read or write the King's English, says he's dumb, but he speaks Cree. How many of you speak Cree? Correct Cree, not correct English, grammatically correct Cree. Is there one? Okay, so this idea of, grammar school, like subject, verb, object, noun, verb, adjective, adverb, and this is how we drill it into the heads of children, how to write. You must have all these things. And she's like, is this how we taught language in Cree? No, we had a different school system. Have we ever thought about that? It depends who you are and whether you think about these things. But she's suggesting that these are not the ways in which we think about the Cree language or Cree people, right? We never really entertained the idea that it was a vibrant, flourishing community, and still is a vibrant, flourishing community despite all the historical trauma, that it's still a current thing happening. Why don't we see it that way? Now I'll just break at this moment. And one of the questions I often bring up in Canadian literature classes is the idea of immigration. And I always bring up language, and since Dumont's talking about language here, I just want to trot out this question again because it's a useful one. Because sometimes there's questions around language, like whether immigrants should learn English when they come to Canada. And usually people are like, yeah, why? Because it makes their life easier, because they can fit in better. And there's the kind of practicality to that answer. And I'm like, sure, okay, fine, but should they be required? Should they be forced to learn language? If you immigrate from China, should you be forced to learn English? And most people kind of say, yeah, no. Some people protest or whatever, disagree, and that's, understandable, and I get that. But my point here is that, one, immigration is different from being indigenous, right? This is not a question of immigration. The other thing is, we should also bring up French, right? That should immigrants be required to learn French? Well, it depends if they're going to live, where they're going to live. So if they're going to live in Quebec, maybe they learn French. If they're going to live in Saskatchewan, maybe they learn English, okay? But I always like to turn this around and say, well, do you speak French? How's your French, okay? Do you speak French? No, you don't speak one of our official Canadian languages? Quel dommage. What's wrong with you? Don't you speak French? It's Canadian language, okay? Now, I'm being a bit of a jerk there, but the point stands, right? She's like, well, do you speak Cree? So it's like when white people came over, during colonial times, did they learn the indigenous languages? Did they learn to speak Cree? Because they were immigrants, settlers, okay? Why the double standard? Oh, now we're back to Drew Hyden Taylor, right? So why don't we learn Cree? And she's like, do you speak Cree? How many of you actually understand the language? I think this is a really important point to stress, is that languages, individual languages, contain an entire way of expressing the world and thinking about the world, that when we lose a language, when it disappears, when it goes extinct, we've lost an entire cultural tradition. And there's a certain amount of work being done now to try and preserve languages because of this understanding that we now have, that we don't all want to speak English, right? At least some of us don't, right? That we should know other languages and other ways of looking at the world. And so she goes into this, is there a received pronunciation of Cree? Is there modern Cree usage? Is there this whole history of the English language? Do we have the equivalent in Cree? We might. Has anybody looked? And if we don't, what tradition do we have in Cree? What is the history of the Cree language? The Chief's Cree, not the King's English. That the linguistic history of Cree is going to be different than the linguistic history of English. Cree and English will have different linguistic histories. And so they'll have different cultural histories. And they'll tell us different things about the world. And if we learn to speak both languages, we'll understand both. But, of course, the title of this poem suggests that one is held up as the Great White Way and the other is the Devil's Language. As if violating God the Father and standard English is like talking backwards. And she uses wards here, and I think that's, a gesture towards residential schools and being wards of the state, right? As if speaking the devil's language is talking backwards, and words are interchanged here. Back to your mother's sound, your mother's tongue, your mother's language. Back to that clearing in the bush, in the tall black spruce. So the childhood memories here re-emerge, that you can't kill or suppress that part of the Indigenous person's learning, that they grew up with this, and it's that cultural memory that persists. And then the third stanza is an investigation of this cultural memory. Near the sound of horses and wind, where you sat on her knee in a canvas tent, and she fed you bannock and tea and syllables. Maybe that's all that the child remembers, is the syllables of her mother that echo in your mind now that you can't make the sound. So notice that the speaker in this poem is losing the capacity to speak the mother tongue, the native language, the Cree, of that voice that rocks you and sings you to sleep in the devil's language. And it's a very abrupt shift, right? That there's this nice maternal memory of what it was like to be in your mother's arms, learning Cree, learning the language, but you've been conditioned now, having been removed from your environment, that now you understand that as the devil's language, right? That we can no longer think of it as Cree. Okay? So she's asking us to consider the ways in which we understand language and different cultures in this very direct and immediate way that seems to be increasingly lost.